would like to give a floor again to United's representative from the United States, Janusz Bugajski, a senior fellow of Jamestown Foundation, Washington, D.C. He's author of more than 20 books about Europe, Russia, transatlantic relationships, and so on. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I don't represent all of the United States, by the way. Actually, something funny that Edward said at the very beginning, how policymakers need to learn the difference between, I don't know, Karelia and Khakassia, or Saka and Bashkortostan. I remember when the Yugoslav war broke out, trying to explain to policymakers the difference between Slovenia, Slovakia and Slavonia. And that was an uphill struggle for quite a time. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to this groundbreaking and what I believe is a state-creating event. And the more that Moscow attacks you, the more that Moscow attacks the forum and its participants, the more it reveals its fear of imperial collapse. So be proud. I will focus my remarks on the benefits that Russia's rupture will bring, although I fully understand some of the dangers that Luke very correctly, very accurately listed as Russia fractures. And in fact, it's part of my new book, and for which we must be prepared. But I want to look at the positives. So 3 main points I want to make. First of all, context. Second, benefits. And thirdly, policy. Context. Russia is a failed state, which happens to be the title of my new book. It is unable to transform itself into a nation state, a civic state, or even a stable imperial state. Russia is a federation in name only. The central government denies any powers to the country's 83 republics and regions, and I deliberately exclude Crimea and Sevastopol as federal subjects. However, the country's multiple weaknesses are now being fully exposed, including a contracting economy, increasingly squeezed by international sanctions, and hopefully by a huge fall in revenue because of, let's say, Europe's increasing energy dependency and Russia's inability to sell at the same price to other countries. Secondly, military defeats in Ukraine that revealed the incompetence and corruption of Russia's ruling elite, and disquiet in numerous regions, which I think will grow over shrinking regional budgets. Moscow is exhausting its capacities to hold the country together. The rupture of the Russian Federation, I believe, will be driven by elite power struggles, and I can't remember, somebody said that this has already begun, and intensifying rivalries between the central government and disaffected regions. It will also embolden the emergence of new states and inter-regional federations that control their own resources and no longer send their men to die for Moscow's empire. I have developed several scenarios of rupture, by the way, in my recent book, various combinations. I mean, you can't just look at the history. You've got to look at any potential new kinds of emergence of new states which can forge relations with neighbours. Okay, concrete benefits, and I'll go through this as quickly as possible. As Moscow turns inwards, its capacity for foreign aggression will diminish. A rump Muscovite state under intense international sanctions, with falling energy revenues, depleted budget, and shorn of its resource base in Siberia without modern technology, will have severely restricted, reduced capabilities to attack its neighbours or foment unrest outside its borders. Its ability to entangle Europe in energy dependence, engage in political corruption, and spread disinformation will be curtailed. NATO's eastern flank from the Arctic to the Black Sea will become more secure, and this will enhance economic development and regional cooperation. Ukraine and Moldova can regain their occupied territories and petition for EU and NATO integration without fear of Russia's reaction. Belarus can secure its independence, build a democracy, and develop productive relations with its neighbours. In the Western Balkans, without Russian support, Serbia's ability to destabilise the region will be reduced, and the threat of partition or armed conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo and Montenegro will recede. The EU project can gather momentum, and NATO will no longer have an internal flank that it will need to protect from Moscow's ambitions. And very good point by my colleague here, Professor Uriarte. The only thing I would add is Spain's recognition of Kosovo, together with the other 4 NATO members, would certainly help in stabilizing and preventing Vučić from setting new fires in the region. I continue. In the Caucasus, Georgia will be able to negotiate the return of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, or the Tchin Valley region, as autonomous republics within a Georgian federation. Armenia and Azerbaijan will be able to sign a peace treaty without Moscow's interference. This will also undercut negative Iranian influences in the region and help Turkey to develop relations with Turkic-speaking states in Central Asia and Turkic nations in the Russian Federation. And of course, for our Caucasian friends, as Georgia and Azerbaijan will be able to forge relations with the emerging independent republics of the North Caucasus and help to guide them to become new partners with Western institutions in various domains. Central Asian states will become increasingly liberated and can deepen their energy, economic and security connections with Europe and NATO. We're already witnessing this. How much more outspoken and independently active are the Central Asian countries as they see Russia weakening? Pro-Western states freed from the Russian Federation can enhance stability in several regions of Europe and Eurasia. China will prove a challenge. Although in a weaker position to expand its influence by collaborating with the failed Russia, no longer has that support. It will seek to benefit from Russia's rupture also by expanding its presence among new states in Siberia and the Pacific, the Far East. The US and the EU must therefore deepen their presence in these regions and work with Japan, with Canada, South Korea and other countries in the Far East to open up avenues for diplomatic, political and economic cooperation with embryonic allies. Regions and republics in Russia's Far East will seek recognition and investment from abroad. And similarly to the Central Asian states, they will resist incorporation into an expanding Chinese economic empire. My third point, this is, I think, penultimate. I have one other after this. Third point, shortcomings of Western policy. Some Russia experts tell us that we help Putin by talking about Russia's collapse, because this allegedly mobilizes the public in support of the regime. On the contrary, I would argue that it is our silence, denials, and the lack of forward policy that helps Moscow. The Kremlin, for instance, claims that the West wants to destroy Russia regardless of US and EU policy. Denials from Washington and Brussels simply fuel Kremlin conspiracies, similarly to the narrative about the alleged NATO threat. Western leaders have tried to convince Russian officials that NATO is not a threat to Russia for over 2 decades. And have failed, I think, to realise that the Kremlin deliberately invents Western threats regardless of actual policy to keep this regime in power. A much more effective approach would be to clearly specify what the West supports in Russia. Open backing for pluralism, democracy, federalism, civil rights, and the autonomy of republics and regions can help embolden Russia's citizens by demonstrating that they are not globally isolated, which is the narrative of the regime. They also need information that Moscow suppresses, especially the advantages of forming new states that cultivate peaceful and productive relations with their neighbours. 2 more points, very quickly. Although nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction remain a potential threat, Russia's leaders will not commit national suicide by using them against the West. As with the Soviet elite, they will try to salvage as much as they can of their political futures and economic fortunes. Even if some emerging states acquire such weapons, we keep hearing about loose nukes, they will have no reason to deploy them while seeking international recognition and economic assistance. Post-Russian states are likely to pursue nuclear disarmament, much like some of the post-Soviet states did after the breakup of the Soviet Union. My last point concerns what I call wishful thinking. Many Western leaders still believe that they can return to the post-Cold War status quo and fail to see the benefits of Russia's disintegration. As a result, instead of planning to capitalize on Russia's de-imperialization, they often appear stuck in this bygone era. I keep hearing this wishful thinking that beneficial relations can be established with a post-Putin Kremlin, or that Russian liberals can democratize the empire. I think Western leaders made a grave mistake when they assumed, and Edward pointed this out with his 3 points, but let me put it a slightly different way, when they assumed that the collapse of Soviet communism ensured the end of Russian imperialism, and Ukraine is now paying the price. They must avoid a second strategic mistake by presuming that the current empire is permanent. Imperial states invariably collapse when they overreach, as Moscow has in Ukraine, and where centrifugal pressures are fueled by economic decline, regional resentments, and national revivals. Government officials, I think, need to learn from forward-looking EU parliamentarians, such as Poland's former Foreign Minister Anna Fotyga, who are reaching out to Russia's republics and regions and demonstrating that citizens of the failed federation do have a future beyond the destructive imperial fantasies of the elite in the Kremlin. And I'll stop there. Thank you.